Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Shop Talk. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lindsay Harris. I'm the Arts Director here at the Academy, and it is my great pleasure to welcome us all back from Sicily, for those of you who have been there, and welcome those back from the weekend, for those of you who have been here, and also now today to build on some of the wonderful interconnectivity that fellows have been exploring through their Shop Talks in recent weeks. Our speakers today have really taken that ball and run with it, as we will see. Arabindan-Kesson and Todd Gray will engage in a conversation, I'm going to use these, about the synergies in their explorations of visual practices and their relationships to history, specifically the histories of colonialism, migration, race, and representation. The conversation, which they've titled From Gallery to Studio, From London to Rome, takes as its starting point Todd's new work currently on view in London at Lehman Mopin Gallery, and even newer work that he's been making in Rome, and dialogues between his visual practice and the range of historical and contemporary art and literature that Anna is investigating at the Academy in her work this spring. Anna is an associate professor of Black diasporic art with a joint appointment in the departments of African American Studies and Art and Archaeology at Princeton University, and here at the Academy she is this year's Terra Foundation Fellow. Prior to completing her doctorate in African American Studies and Art History at Yale University, Anna practiced as a registered nurse. And I mention this because it seems to me, at least, that this experience contributed in part to the vastly interdisciplinary focus of her scholarly work, which interweaves art and the histories of race, empire, medicine, and transatlantic visual culture in the long 19th century. Her first book, Black Bodies, White Gold, Art, Cotton, and Commerce in the Atlantic World, was published with Duke University Press in 2021. In Rome, she is considering what the Grand Tour, and by extension Italy, meant for Black artists and writers during this period of her focus. As her conversation with Todd will demonstrate, her impetus for exploring these topics comes from the work of contemporary artists who centralize the role of the Black diaspora through slavery, colonialism, and migration in shaping Europe. A key question guiding her work, which I think extends to the work of many of us here today, is how does seeing our past differently reframe our vision of the present? This question is also central to Todd's visual practice, which he is pursuing in Rome this spring as the recipient of the Joseph H. Hazen Rome Prize in Visual Art. Todd works in photography, performance, and sculpture to explore diasporic dislocations and cultural connections between Western hegemony and West Africa, which he experiences firsthand by working between Los Angeles and Ghana. A professor emeritus at California State University at Long Beach, Todd has earned a host of accolades for his work, which include a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship in 2018, a Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Residency Fellowship in 2016, and a host of others. His work is in many public collections that we can all enjoy as we continue our travels from here, including the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, also the Studio Museum in Harlem, also in New York, the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa, and the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne in Australia. So please join me in welcoming Anna and Todd to the front, though connected to the audience, for what I'm sure will be a dynamic and insightful exchange of ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay, for that wonderful introduction. Thanks, everyone, for getting up. Those of you who've arrived from Sicily. And big thanks to the Academy for this once-in-a-lifetime experience. Really grateful to be here and grateful to have these interactions with fellows, visitors, residents, the whole community. Thank you.
Yes, this is on. Yeah, I want to echo Todd's thanks to the Academy. I wanted to say that for a while. I'll never say it anywhere else. So. And also, I just wanted to start by just acknowledging the communities whose lands and lives and labour continue to sustain the work that we do here and the work that we might be doing elsewhere. Particularly given the focus of this talk, I felt like that was an important acknowledgement to make before we begin. I think the other point just to make in framing this conversation, or maybe there are a couple of points, is that it's really informal and completely unscripted. And so we're using Todd's incredible work as a sort of space of convergence for our different practices and ideas. We're thinking about it, I think, sort of like a gallery walkthrough, right?
Yeah, that's one of the metaphors that we discussed, and something I'm very familiar with, just having finished a couple walkthroughs in London a few weeks ago when my show opened up. And so we're using that approach as well as it's just an ongoing conversation at a cocktail party about our work. So, so I thought that was appropriate.
Yeah, and the other, I mean, I think we've sort of sketched the trajectory. So we're moving from Todd's gallery show, and we'll end with a couple of works that he's been making in his studio. We're also moving from London, where his gallery show is, to Rome, and that just sort of felt like an important point to make for me as a 19th century nerd, because that's really the trajectory of the Grand Tour that many artists were making in the 19th century. The artists that I'm working on included. And this is just you can download this. This is a guide to studios in Rome from 1860. So just another kind of spatial orientation, a little prop maybe for you to sort of put yourself in an imaginary space as we start the conversation. We've also sort of organized it to cohere around sort of three key words, beginning with circulation. So the first work that we're going to talk about is Green Green.
Yeah, this is going to give me an opportunity to, since this is a shop talk, to really show you how the sausage is made. So I'll get back to this, but this is the primary work that's in my show in London. And it started off, I'm constantly referring to my archives, my photo archives that I've been building for over 40 years. And I'm replenishing them without any idea of how I'm going to use the work. Well, I have a loose idea, but not a specific idea. So the image on the left, the horizontal image, is of wetlands adjacent to a pathway, a slave trail in Ghana that's been used for hundreds of years. And I'd say in the last 2 years, I've been walking in slave trails in Ghana, making photographs, and I was always looking down and photographing the trail itself. And then I said, well, I don't need to be so specific, and I can take the landscape around it, which is so lush and beautiful that I'm conflicted a bit, because it's easy to forget and just to get completely absorbed and lost in the beauty of those spaces, of nature. So it's always a little conflicted for me. The image on the right is of a slave castle, a slave fort, originally, and it's in Axim, which is just west of the capital city of Accra. The first, of course, valuable goods was gold, and so these fortresses were made to house gold, protect gold until a ship could come and it could be transported. And then, of course, what replaced gold were humans, were Africans that were being shipped. And this, when I looked at this wall, I was immediately taken by, well, first you have to understand the psycho-emotional state that one might be in when you're in the space, which I've been in them quite often. I've been shooting slave castles all all up and down the coast in Ghana. You start getting desensitized to it, and then you're aware of that. And when I have a camera, my mind switches, and I'm really focused on what I'm capturing. And the first thing that hit me was just, my goodness, this is just so sublimely beautiful. It's just amazingly beautiful. And that just stopped me. And in my practice, I just try to be very sensitive to how my psycho-emotional reaction is to something my eyes perceive. And without question, I photograph it. Whereas 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I would question, why am I doing this, before I would hit the shutter. And it was a very critical inner dialogue that I would engage. And now what I'm trying to do is just flow and become more improvisational and say, you know what, after I do the image, when I'm back in the studio, then I'll have a critical dialogue. But right now, I'm just going to be responsive to my body. My body is responding in a certain way. My emotional state is vibrating at a certain frequency, and that's how I'm going to respond. So I needed to problematize it. This is how I normally do it. I start with an image. In this way, I started with a slave, with a wall in a slave castle. And then I knew it was just so green and lush, and it reminded me, wow, how the moss, the nature, I paired it with this image. But then that wasn't enough, so I threw it off axis, and I saw how it's circulating. I saw how these lines are connecting, and it was really aesthetically absorbing. It was very pleasing, it was very beautiful, and so forth. And then I realized, you know what, it's a little too easy, it's a little too aestheticized. So I thought, how can I disrupt this? What can I do? And I immediately thought of a work I did about 7 years ago when I was working with my Michael Jackson archive of works that I photographed of him when I was his personal photographer in the 80s. So I photographed an image of Michael and Chuck Berry, and how there's this intergenerational relationship going on, and this connection. Just a little aside, that at that time, that was a Black Power handshake. That's where GIs in Vietnam would know they're standing by shaking their hands in that certain way, and you'd know where they were politically. You know, it's how you shake your hands. And of course it's ubiquitous, it's sports, it's everything, but it started in the 60s, this handshake. So in any event, I had this image that was my first 2 years when I started working in this way of taking photographs, framing them, and then placing them on top of each other, which came out of a conversation I had when a couple of artists, and I discovered the work of Stuart Hall, the critical writings of Stuart Hall. And what Stuart Hall was saying, you cannot, hegemony is so encompassing that you cannot overthrow hegemony. But where our power resides is the act of resistance, constant resistance, and by questioning normativity. So what I decided was to apply that to photography. And I would question, why does a photograph have to be flat? Why does a photograph have to have 90-degree angles, corners? And I would question, and that's when I started coming up with this idea of obscuring information. Why does a photograph provide an answer? Why can't it present a question? And so that's how I was thinking and working in this earlier way. And so that's just sort of some background to my practice. Then I came up and decided that this is really great, and it also starts telling my story, because as I go through the archive, I realize how it's also autobiographical. And this is a way to go from the trail to the castle and into the unknown, which is my historic story. And it became personal, and it really clicked for me. And so, and this is how it appears in the final form in the gallery in London. The exhibition is called On Point. So,
Can we just go back to that
yes, absolutely.
first one? So I was I didn't mention this to you when I talked to you earlier. I totally forgot, but I was just thinking again about what you were saying about stories and the roots, the circulations, and I remember reading, and I still teach Saidiya Hartman's "Lose Your Mother," and there's such a feeling of, it's both kind of possibility but deep loss. And I just wondered whether you could talk a little bit more about that, because you brought us into this first by asking us to think about that emotional experience.
Well, it's from my reading of Losing Your Mother.
Yeah, Lose Your Mother, yeah.
Lose Your Mother, and her conversations with Ghanaians who would deny that they had any connection to slavery and disowning it. And that's when I got the idea to do slave trails, from reading that and started talking to people and so forth. So that's sort of like on point in that way. The beauty is a balm to entice the viewer into it, because there's a lot of tragedy and trauma and horror, in it. And I think, in a way, it's all of the work that I do sort of addresses the past and addresses this this loss, these feelings I have of, I guess loss is about the best way to say it. And it's also keyed on this idea of mental colonialism, which is this denial that this has happened, this embrace of, well, it's supposed to be this way because I am subaltern, I am from the South, I should be dominated because I'm less than. And it took years for me to realize that. So I think we'll have to revisit this as we come up. I mean, that image of the wall is so powerful and overwhelming that I think I had to make it as beautiful as I possibly could as a counterpoint, just to look at it with some kind of ease.
I like that a lot. I think also because it's so abstracted, and you have this this tension between the figure and the abstraction, and the way abstraction works almost in archives, right, to kind of abstract bodies out, and there's this sort of interesting oppositional tension here.
What really got me also was that this villager is wearing these sort of like British tropical clothes. And that just sort of blew my mind after being colonized and so forth, that you embrace the dress of the colonizer. And I remember when I was on the boat in the lagoon, and I saw that immediately. That's what caught my eye, and it made me think of my embrace of being colonized, But that's what for me, that becomes a really tricky signifier. Even though he did not go through this journey, mentally he's gone, or is going through this journey. Of this colonized mind. Yeah.
So I'm using these PowerPoints, so I'm not very technologically savvy, but almost as a kind of mind mapping exercise, which is really, I guess, a way of explaining how I do my research. And one of the joys of this conversation is that, you know, I work in the 19th, 18th, 19th century, but always in conversation with contemporary artists. And so they are really, I think, for me, contemporary artists are the people who give art historians the methodologies to work through these historical materials, archives, these historical narratives. So when I saw Green, I was really taken on many levels. But you know, my work is about, so far, has been about different kinds of circulations of objects, of materials, you know, alongside the circulation of enslaved people, indentured people across the British Empire, primarily. And I think also, as Todd was talking, my work is intensely personal. It is for me also a way of figuring out personal histories, personal experiences. I joke, but it's not really a joke. I'm a child of empire. I grew up in all these different parts of the British Empire, and that still has shaped so much of my life and my family's life. And so it was really, you know, I was a nurse. I was taught by First Nations communities, and they were really the women who showed me the kind of effects of colonialism on the very real bodily experiences of people. And it was people like Stuart Hall who then, when I went to university, gave me the language to start working through. So one of the things that, you know, in my book is, I'm interested, Stuart Hall talks about the inside and outside histories, the sort of histories of Britain that are always connected to these colonial histories, and that's sort of what I try and work through. And I see that in this work, but also I think, you know, you talk the way the figure is also a kind of amplification of these picturesque figures, right, where black people are, you know, become part of the landscape, these sort of domesticated figures. And so my work really starts with the plantation as the site of visual and economic production, and kind of moves out from there. And I was thinking too about the clothes he's wearing and the cotton and the sort of relationship to works like Agostino Brunia's, where you see different ships, right? These are the ships that are connecting the Caribbean with Europe and West Africa, as are the textiles that were, and these are textiles that were made in the UK and sent to Brazil, but earlier would have been sent to West Africa to buy and sell enslaved people. So that, you know, so it really, it was like a beautiful visualization of so many things I've been trying to work through. Sorry.
Well, that's part of the richness. I remember the initial conversation that we had when Anna saw the work, and I had not heard these relationships, these other readings to my work as an artist. You become completely anchored in your own narrative to the work, and it's just so mind-opening to hear the alternative dialogues and rich dialogues that I can immediately connect to. And so
So the other aspect of this work that I found really profound is, I think it's also, you know, helps us think about these movements to Europe that are taking place, you know, particularly for me, with these black writers and artists in the 19th century. To me, in many ways, like the idea of the Grand Tour, this idea of Europe as this site of possibility of, you know, of Western civilization, etc., you know, it is sustained by these histories of circulation that we've just talked about. And I just put up, so I was thinking about this young man who's on the boat and, you know, moving, and I think many of you know I'm interested in this writer, David Dorr, who was an enslaved man who comes to Europe between 1851 and 1853. He goes through Europe and then into North Africa. And he writes this amazing travel narrative, also downloadable on Google. And he's really like a black flaneur. He's like writing like Baudelaire, well before Baudelaire's writing. And it's this amazing observation of Europe and European manners. But he talks about starting this is the first sentence, I commenced my writings of a promiscuous voyage. And this narrative is just shot through with these moments of eroticism, desire, of possibilities, and so, just thinking about these different voyages. And then also, this is just a quote from Frederick Douglass. In his 1892 narrative, there's a couple of chapters about his travels through Europe and Italy, in particular, and he makes this very clear connection between Italy and Africa. And so, again, this sort of, the way your work is creating a sort of, or speaking both to us as sort of prehistory and a future, is, I think, again, a really powerful aspect.
But then that's perfect for this slide. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 photographs layered on top of each other. The way I start my thinking is by, and one of the most important components of the work is the foundation photograph. And that would be this one here, which is from the National Palace in Lisbon. With my Guggenheim, I was in Europe photographing imperial gardens, imperial architecture, who enriched themselves through Africa. So the colonization of Africa and so forth. And so while I was in Lisbon, I just saw this peculiar monument. And actually you see these rocks at the bottom. It's in tribute to the material that was gathered to rebuild the palace after an earthquake. So they actually made this memorial, this monument for these rocks. And which I didn't find out for a couple of years afterwards, but it was just so peculiar. And then this piece, this is a piece of architecture in San Francisco. So here we are mimicking this Baroque aesthetic. And this was done in the early 20th century. And so it sort of reminds me that yes, I'm in America, but I'm in Europe. I'm always in Europe. You're never really escaping Europe in that way. It's the oval frames is both the past, the present, and the future for me. The Atlantic Ocean is something I think about after reading In the Wake, and about all of the bodies that were thrown overboard and so forth, and all of these lost souls at the bottom of the Atlantic for the Middle Passage. And it took on great significance. So this first, this image in the back is taken from our home that Kenny and I built a studio in Ghana about 15 years ago. And I'm constantly, when I look out at the Atlantic, it's beautiful. And then every so often, I remember what's occurred, or what's been allowed to transpire across this body of water. And then at the slave castle, this bird just transfixed me. And this moment of these men they're probably not talking about that particular bird passing, it's impossible. But what the photograph, which freezes something, I think that photograph is the most just surreal document piece of material, I mean, a microsecond is frozen. And then you're sort of taking a sliver of reality out and fixing it so that you can examine it. And in this way, in this position, it becomes, for me, this idea of this, of the future, of a dream, of possibility. And the way this figure is gesturing down was really caught my eye. And then, of course, making the two horizon lines at the same point. Double Dutch was just a skip rope game that we played when I was a child, and that it just sort of felt appropriate for this, and also the fort was occupied by the Dutch at some point. Oh.
Yeah, played it a lot. So funny, I was running past that building this weekend, and it is bizarre. I mean, it's also, I didn't realize this about the rocks because one thing I noticed in Lisbon was that because of that earthquake, so much of its colonial archives were destroyed, and so it's really interesting. So this is a quote from David Dorr. And when I was looking at this, I was actually just looking at thinking about this colours, the gold, these men sort of looking out, and this idea of looking out towards Europe that someone like Dorr's doing, and the idea of Europe as another kind of dreamscape. And I was also really interested in the way the layering of these particular images also reminded me of tourist postcards, right, or snapshots that you might take while you're on holiday and send. And again, the way so it's leisure, it's consumption, tourism, beauty, and also just horror. And the other artist whose work I was thinking about when I looked at this and when I was reading David Dorr's work is Joy Gregory, who some of you might know. She's a British artist, has been working, she is a significant member of the kind of Black British art movement. And this is a work called Cinderella Tours, which was her sort of take on the Grand Tour. And so do you know this?
No.
This series?
Wait, that image was familiar.
Okay.
And so I've seen that image.
So she goes to different parts of Europe, Italy in particular, and has these shoes that she kind of uses as a surrogate for all kinds of different bodies and ideas. But she's thinking in two ways, both about Europe's relationship to Africa and that extraction of resource, right? So Africa as a kind of El Dorado in a way, but also the influx of migrants to Europe as a space for their possibilities for them too. So she's sort of exploring those tensions, but I think also allowing for this, kitsch, but also a kind of beauty, a kind of style that I think your work, while it's still very much about these horrors, still creates that space, right, for...
Yeah, and the abundance of visual stimuli is important. The whole Rococo aspect, I really embrace, and I'm trying to supercharge it. I want to overstimulate. I'm sort of aware of that. But also, the layering is really important because the histories are in there, and that's something that I'm even more aware of while I'm here and walking through Rome, is all of these layered histories being present. The gold of course, the slippers, the gold extracted from the Gold Coast, which was the name of Ghana before independence, comes to mind.
So the other work I just wanted to put in conversation very, very briefly is This is one of Robert Duncanson's Italian, I think it's just called Landscape, Italian Landscape with Ruins, and this is at the New York Historical Society. But I was just interested in this, oval shape. I've known Barclay Hendricks started doing oval landscapes just before he passed. Stacey Lynn Waddell is doing a lot of oval landscapes, also with gold inlaid. And I don't know, I'm going to put you on the spot, but I'm just really interested in, it's like a mirror, it's reflection, it's also so intimate and enclosing, and, there's the juxtaposition of the sort of square and the oval is really...
It's the tensions that it creates, and that's what I'm really interested in the geometry that it disrupts by placing these these ovals within a rectangular space. Also because it immediately makes me think of a portrait, of a cameo, and I'm thinking that the scape, the place, is a portrait, and that makes it makes me go forward, and it stimulates this recontextualizing this idea of an oval and becoming a portrait is important, and it makes me think. Wait, I've gone off in a tangent.
That's good.
What I'm trying to get at a lot of time is to make the viewer conscious that they're making meaning, and I do that by withholding a lot of visual information, by covering it up. And so hopefully I'm stimulating a desire to know, a desire to name, and I'm trying to frustrate the desire to name. We want to name because we want to understand. By naming, we control. And so I'm trying to use photography's greatest asset, which it's analogous, as an analog, as to being one of the clearest evidence of naming something, because it's so, it's a perfect replica, and that is, for me, a way for the viewer to think about the possibility of another way, another meaning, another outcome. And so that we aren't just projecting what we already know and reconfirming that the world that we inhabit, but the possibility of imagining something else. So I think of it also like when you're the clutch. I'm trying to engage the mental clutch of the viewer, so they can't just go right into gear automatically and name something, and their worldview is reconfirmed. So when I'm doing this, actually I'm doing it for me, so that my worldview is not so reconfirmed, and I can think and imagine other possibilities. All of the work I do, I'm the first person. I do it for me to get excited. I do it to me to become confounded. I do it for me to actually bring something in the world that I've never seen before, because that's what gets me up in the morning. Is this, wow, I had no idea, 2 hours ago this did not exist, and I've never ever seen anything like that. So that's primary.
Well, that's a good way to move to, I think, the next sort of portion or keyword, which is about composition, and I think we'll probably go back to this issue of these ovals. But so this is just an installation shot from your exhibition, and I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you were thinking about the hang to kind of create a narrative for the exhibition, that through the narrative of these works, and then we'll go into them a little more deeply. But
yeah, this is a detail. One section. There's about 7 images, 7 works in the show, and what turned out is I like the way that the ovals, the rhythms that are created, and also there in 3 of them there's musical references, and so that became apparent to me not when I was in the studio working on a model, but actually when I was in the space, and I realized, wow, I put everything with a musical reference in the same room. But that was not my intention. It just worked together. So I thought, well, how was it that I wasn't conscious that I was doing that? But I was, the unconscious is always, I'm always open. Also, the sizes, the changes in size is important. This piece on the right is just a little larger than this work, and so it's really a lot to do with the visual rhythm. And unfortunately, I don't have the other piece right here, but that green is on a wall right here. If you carry this wall out, that's where the green is, because I wanted when you go into the space, I wanted that to be the first impression, and just to have this huge body, this color coming at you. And then easing into these other works that I'm extracting pieces that I made from the 1980s when I did a studio performance piece, and I used myself as subject. En Pointe was like my most recognized photograph I've taken of Jackson. I've never, for 2 years, I used my Jackson archive as a way to position him in the African diaspora. So, and my strategy was I cannot show his face, because once his face is shown, the viewer will not consider anything else but the spectacle of his face. So I tried to disrupt that connection, and that's what really got me thinking about layering frames on top of frames when I first did this. So for 2 years, I was using my MJ archive and combining it with the work I've made in Ghana, and in a way to position him. And that was in the Nicholas Cullinan curated exhibition, Michael Jackson on the Wall, that was traveled from the National Portrait Gallery in London. But I never used this image, because I just thought it was just too recognizable, and it's too fixed in meaning. And then, of course, after the documentary film of a few years ago, it became verboten. Like nobody wanted to talk about Jackson. And I was at a talk about, I don't know, 5 months ago, and Hamza Walker was saying, a curator in Los Angeles, was saying, you know what? You can't get rid of this man. He's permanently in the culture. You're going to hear him, even if it's not his music. It's affected so much. The sonic representation, the sonic echoing of Michael Jackson is all over pop music and so forth. You're never going to get away. And that's what made me think also that, the flaw of being human, the flaws I have. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to make a piece. And so this is one of the few times I started off with the middle image, trying to build a work around this, and where could I go with it? So when I had taken this picture a couple of years ago at the Fontainebleau Palace, and this was a tapestry, it really reminded me of the fantasies, the elephant and the chimp, all of these figures. It really put Michael right to the forefront of my mind. And that's when I thought, oh wait, this could work. And also the mythology, because now he's mythologized in our culture. And then I thought also, well, when I made this work in the 80s, it was called the Urban Myth Series. And it was because I cannot trace my history past my grandfather. No one will admit that they've been enslaved, so there's no information. So I took that right after I got out of art school as a way to make works that I'm going to invent my own history. I'm going to invent my own mythology. So hence the Urban Myth series. And I did a series of images in the studio. And some were in silhouette, some not. And in this one, I was signing for like a double, a horn figure. And that's the significance it has for myself. I don't expect that for other readers. But it was also this darkness, this inner darkness, this inner pathology that comes with a black body, and how I signed for that, and how that's when I thought, I'm going to place that right on top of his shoes to sort of talk about this being fixed as a pathological being, and that is the construct of blackness in Western culture. So that's kind of the whole thinking that went there, and of course, the balancing act of this frame on that urn. Don't be slipping. Don't be slipping, because it's so easy to just slip and fall off that pedestal. And that's something my parents always told us, is that we represent the race. We're the first generation. I was born in 1954, and so when my parents always said, hey, when you're out in public, you gotta act correct. You gotta be correct all the time, because any misdeed that you make, it's gonna reflect on everybody, because you're the first through the door. So that sort of idea of how you gotta stay on point and balance on top of this urn, and you only have one chance, because you're not allowed a second chance as a black person. I also, this blue, you can't see it, it's a little blown out, but the blue light on the stage, the blue urn, how it sort of, the light comes and falls into the urn, that really attracted me. And those are some of the thoughts I used in putting this together.
I really love the way you were talking about these different, or the juxtaposition of these different sort of fantasies, or the sort of uncanniness of it. Because I think for me, often research is also a process that is about putting these often strange things together and then figuring out. And that was what I really liked about you talking about the installation too, the way that research can be about narrating a story through these resonances. I find that is often how I end up writing, I think. But I mean, with this one too, I mean, I'm just really also taken by the colours, as much as the composition, but and then the relationship of these different textures. I mean, this is a textile, right? And then the sort of gelatinous texture that kind of peeks out, and then the really glossy, the shoes. I was also, thinking about music here again, I mean, you've talked about this other history of MJ and what Michael Jackson means or has meant at different moments. But I think also it's just important, again, because the work can move between these different registers, to think about your layering in relation, say, to someone like Rome Prize, the way music also becomes a site of, Robin, excuse me, Robin Kelly talks about music and so does Shanna Redman, actually, in terms of freedom dreaming, this sort of site of collective imagination. And I was just thinking about Toni Morrison's description of Rome's work. And, there's a sort of sculptural / collage quality to your work. And I think what Toni Morrison makes really clear is that collage is not necessarily about rupture, but actually about layering. And I was interested in that.
Well, for me, the layering works when you're not conscious that it's happening, when it becomes a unified pictorial space. So when these legs, are inferred and pop up in that shoe, that's really for me, exciting, and I feel like, I've I've succeeded in what part of the criteria that is important to me when I put these works on top of another, because I'm trying to disrupt, but at the same time I'm trying to unify. So it's an odd contradiction that I'm embracing, and that I'm chasing all the time. So the fractured and the fragmented, well, in a way, I'm trying to create harmony out of the fractures and the fragments, so that they cohere and they come together. And I think of that kind of position as being, okay, how can I harmonize these works, so that they're singing together.
That's it. Yeah, harmonize is I think a nice phrase, term to use. I don't know if I have time. The other thing I was just going to point out really quickly, because you were talking about this idea of not slipping, of sustaining, and just about other figures in Western art that also hold up, sustain. This is just a quote from Yusuf Komunyaca's poem Blackamoors from Villa La Pieta. And if anyone's been to that villa, you'll know that there are many blackamoors in there. But so this was just, a kind of, just to make that visual resonance. I'm not going to talk about Sylvia Wynter, but we can maybe talk about her later if we need. But again, just the way that, the construction of not just Western art and the canon, but also, kind of Western philosophy, Western thought, is also sustained by these histories, by particular communities.
Well, in this way, look how it's also inverted.
Exactly.
That's what I really like about how you put those two together.
Yeah, it's exactly. Well, that's what you've done. So I wanted to move to this work because I think, again, we can move more into the musicality and again, this shape, but I'll let you talk first, and then I'll put the other images up that I found.
Okay. In my solitude, I can't really explain this work. As I collaged it, as I put these works together, again, a scene, or rather a wetlands that's adjacent to a slave trail, a picture of the Atlantic, and then for me, when I made this photograph of myself in 1981, I couldn't exhibit. I saw my friends who came out of CalArts, they were exhibiting and so forth, and I was just really pissed. I had gone to Italy. I went to Milan. I got 6-7 pages of Italian Vogue, and I thought for sure when I come back to LA, when I come back to America, I'll finally work. And nothing happened. Whereas I sustained myself as a commercial photographer so that I could have time to make my art. So I was really frustrated and I was super angry. And that's when I was making some of this work. And I thought, what would be the most horrific image I could think of, or the most stereotypical image of a black man? And I thought, well, we're supposed to have these talents, and one of which is music. And so it's a given. And so I wanted to make an image that's saying, like, I am so stupid that I don't even know how to blow into a trumpet, to sort of take that away. And that's what I made this image. But it's really funny. I had someone come in and look at this work, and they said, for them, it signified, my God, this person's so creative that they can make music even by inverting it. So I'm not trying to project that onto the audience. I understand that everyone has their individual meaning, but this was such a charged image, and of course that comes to the psychological state I was when I made it, and that carries. So whenever I look at it, it sparks that state, that psychological state, that psycho-emotional state, and also of course, the sonic, these shapes echoing out, so the sonic resonance is leaving the picture space, and that becomes clear to me in putting it together. This was a real key, and I started this with this image. This is what, that was the first work, and then it was the Atlantic, but it was so, it needed more, and it needed to be I needed to throw some vinegar into that mix, and that's when I came to this image. And then in my solitude was Billie Holiday. I was just kept thinking of that kind of pain that I hear in her voice, and that's how it came up.
So I was actually, when I saw this, when I saw this work, I was just immediately thinking about Moses Williams, who's one of the first African-American artists we know about from the early 19th century, and he was a silhouette artist. And he was based in Philadelphia and connected to the Peel family. And then I just found these really quite beautiful portraits of two African-American 19th century musicians, and I was just riffing, thinking about visual resonances, and this. It just made me think of your work, and again, I think these trans-historical conversations are really important to me. I teach 19th century black art, and many of my students are like, what? Who, where, what? This doesn't look like the black art I think of, and so it's really important to me, obviously, to historicize, but this was, again, thinking about silhouettes and portraiture as forms of representation, the mobility of these forms, the intimacy that they also create between who's making, who's been represented, and then who's holding them afterwards, was really fascinating to me too.
Seeing this slide, I'd really like to have this in an installation, and have those two pieces physically on the wall in proximity to this one, because what a sort of rich dialogue. It's funny, when I first glanced at it, I just assumed, oh look, these are the black men that you found. And not even thinking that, no, they're not. only in the silhouette are they black. These aren't African individuals.
These ones are.
Oh.
These two, this is why it's quite rare, because they're actually one of the few portraits we have.
You can see I don't read either.
It's unscripted, remember? No. No, these are two black musicians from the 19th century. These are some of the few representations we have of them. And this is actually Moses Williams' self-portrait, right? So this is how he advertised himself as a cutter of profiles.
Wow.
And that's his.
Wow.
So I think this is in Philly somewhere.
Wow.
I'm not sure where that one is, but yeah, you should definitely
love it. Yeah.
make that installation.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other, just for time, I'm just going to move through. So the other aspect I was really fascinated with here is this sort of background mangroves, like the swampy space, and it reminded me of Green on Green. And I'm writing a book about the plantation and forms of medicine, but so I'll very briefly talk about Sylvia Wynter here, but she's a Jamaican philosopher based in Northern California. But she has this great essay where she talks about the plot, and you can see it here. So the plot was basically the space on the plantation that plantation owners kind of allowed enslaved people to work with. And it was a kind of a cost-saving mechanism because they could grow their own food. And she's sort of interested in the plot as a space here where we can start to think about resistance to the market extractive system of the plantation. And so the plot might be a place where enslaved people grew their own food, where they made music, right, where they sustained themselves in different ways, and certainly grew forms of herbal medicine. And so I was thinking about this, this space as a site of fugitivity, and also the way music has played such an important role in that history, right, of resistance. And
I wanted to go back because I thought it was really odd. Even though I heard you say about your students, even though it's there in text, I still insisted that these were Europeans. And so I wanted to go, wait, how did that occur? How did I, just completely miss that? And I just think it's for me, like your students were saying, what? There was black art, made at this point. And so I just thought it was, wow, that idea is so entrenched that my mind didn't allow it at that moment. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out. Hoods in the Garden. I was using frames that I would find in pawn shops in black neighborhoods, as well as decommissioned frames from LA County Museum when they would find a work that wasn't archived that did not have materials that were up to their standards, so they would reframe them and I would get the frames. And so that's something I was using, and also it made it a lot more economical to work with. This is from Versailles. This was a hooded figure, but as soon as I saw it and the lattice in the background, I immediately thought of lynching. And I immediately thought of just captured bodies and taken away. And then the green connecting the two, it was a really quick piece to make. It was so clear what I could do, and the way that this mangrove is reflecting, and the reflection becomes almost dreamlike, and that really captivated me.
yeah, I was thinking that when I first looked at this too. I was thinking you can't be particularly from the US, right, and not see that and not think about lynching, the KKK. But then I was also thinking that that hood is there to somehow like protect.
Yeah.
So it's also this kind of this sort of sense of care and preservation that is also, in terms of landscape as well, like the sort of preservations of different kinds of landscapes or their maintenance. So it was the tension was really, I think, really striking here. And I was actually also, if you just click it quickly, I was looking at it this morning and I was like, oh, it just reminded me of Edmonia Lewis. This is her Death of Cleopatra. Do you know this sculpture?
No.
So it was displayed, sorry, I put this in as that. But it was displayed in 1876 at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. So she made it somewhere here, right down the road. And sent it to Philly, and it was really. So for me, the visual resonances were the sort of the stone, the textiles, that the kind of the drapery, but also like this is just after Cleopatra's been. What is she? She gets bitten by an adder or something, right? So she's dying, but all the 19th century commentators were like, oh my gosh, she's in some kind of ecstasy. This is like X-rated, right? So it got very mixed reviews. but I was, again, just the visual resonances of the textures of marble and fabric were interesting to me, but also just to think about, these black sculptors who were here, in the 19th century, and what they might have been seeing too, so.
This is also right across the image that you saw of En Pont and the In My Solitude, the silhouette with the trumpet. That's in the gallery. So you didn't see an installation shot, but that's what I was saying. They all have these musical references. Just to let you know, this was like going to be a work on its own. This is a photograph of this band, Fishbone, a ska band from LA that I took in the 90s, and it is behind it is a glitch. My camera malfunctioned, my camera chip, a memory chip malfunctioned, so that distortion was caused from the technology, the flaw. And it just felt really resonant, the way that this figure is falling through this ruptured space with this incredible chroma, and I was really satisfied, and that would be that. And then I just happened to have this photograph sitting next to it of the two cannons at the slave castle, and once I put it right on these photos, right on top of each other, something just exploded in my head, or the connection was really clear. And for me, this other narrative of being shot out of a cannon, the ruptures that occur when you cross the Atlantic, and this constant chaotic swirl, yeah, I mean, it works on its own, but it just takes on, when it's combined with the Atlantic, that's my story. And it also becomes me doing all of these musical performances, you have to lay on your back exposed. I mean, anyway, there's so many other meanings that I start extruding from it.
I also like the idea of glitch, which is now becoming such an important theoretical term in, like Fred Moten's, use of interruption, and Ebony Russell's new book on glitch feminism. Just the way that forms of black performance also disrupt the kind of scripted ideas about the body, about race, but also how these moments of glitch make or reveal the system, so I think that's a nice, it's a beautiful kind of visual metaphor for, so yeah, the last couple of slides were really about idea of remnants, but I just wanted to include these two quotes because to me, I think what your work does, and I think what I would like my work to do is to use the past, right, to think about where we can go from here. And so, of course, I really love Sunra's poem, but also Saidiya's quote about beauty, and this love of too much, which you talked about too, that kind of rococo. And this, I don't know if you've read Christina Sharp's essay about beauty, but it opens with Saidiya. And it's an essay called "Beauty is a Method." Anyway, I can send it to you. But so these are just kind of, again, just sort of orientation points for the last couple of slides.
Yeah, and I've got to say that I was actually, my undergraduate education was postmodern, and one should be aware of beauty and not to be seduced by beauty because that is a distraction and it's the opiate for the people, blah, blah, blah. And then it was just 10 years ago or so, I decided I'm going to embrace it, and I'm going to work with it, and I'm going to use it as a tool. So this is This is something that I've been making since I've been here. I've just been going out with my camera and photographing what catches my eye. And then, of course, I brought my archive with my digital archive. So this is an image that I made in the 80s of my foot. And layering interiors of churches with the ruins that I happen upon, and this time. So 1, 2, 3 images layered on top of each other. And so I work in this way, collaging, and then I'll, of course, go back, frame them individually, and place them on top of each other. But it's been, this whole city is so incredibly beautiful. It's intimidating, and it makes me also think, am I actually making images kitsch? Am I just regurgitating what I see, as every tourist is here making these images? You know, when I stand someplace and I bring up my camera, I look to my left, I look to my right, there's someone else taking that image, and then having to just trust myself, knowing when I get back to the studio, then meaning will come. But I'm gonna just keep traveling and keep floating and seeing what occurs.
Yeah, I love, when I saw this in your studio, I just fell in love with it. I mean, again, the way you're thinking about where we start from, like what's sustaining what, but also the incorporation of these ruins, like this, the sort of layered histories that make up Rome. And I just wanted to put Duncanson's work in conversation because, you know, as you're going around Rome, he was too, and he made sketches and then went back to his studio in Cincinnati and, you know, turned them into paintings. So it was just, again, just me being a little bit of a nerd. But sorry.
No, but also that balancing again. You know, don't be slipping.
Yeah.
The way the foot is there and underfoot is this work. As I go through these ruins, I just think about all of those bodies doing all of that labor, and then those rulers, you know, just commanding, get it done. And so I think underneath all of that, are all of the millions of bodies that labored to make it possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think is also, for someone like Duncanson, I often wonder, like, what, he was coming here in the 19th century as so much of these histories were being excavated, and many of his paintings sort of show these different layers of Italy in different ways. And so, you know, I was thinking, or I am interested in what possibilities Italy still held, though, for Black artists in the mid-19th century, right? Because many of his paintings are also these explorations of the past, but they have this sense of looking forward, which I think, you know, is also part of what you're thinking about. So remnants and ruins play a big part in his work. But I was also thinking about the remnants of artists or of Black, as you were saying, Black communities, of communities who've labored to sustain what we can do, who are here and who are unknown. And this is just, so I recently found out that another African-American sculptor called Eugene Warburg, who's from New Orleans, actually died in Rome in 1859, and he's buried in this cemetery, like the name, I'm sorry, I've completely forgotten. It's up near La Sapienza. Don't know where his grave is, but it's in there. So there are these other sort of remnants and other layers too, but this balancing act, I think, is a good way to finish, because I wanted to finish with this work.
Which it started, of course, of the image from this dome, and I kept thinking about it, looking at it, putting image, going through my archive, and then I just realized, wait, I need a stairway. I need one to enter into this space. And so this is a stairway that goes into a slave castle. So here you have your heaven, and here you have your promise. But made me think of Leopold, of the missionaries, you know, or the promise of taking you out of your barbarism by salvation. And even if we have to kill you, we're going to kill you to save you. You know, all of those ideas were came and connected when I put these two works together.
I think when I saw it, I was just immediately struck by the way you're showing us, right? What underpins all of this, like this history of racial capitalism that has given us everything, you know. Oh, and well, again, just visual resonances. Sorry, I just wanted to get to, because I love the way that your work is like a portal. You know, it takes us, we kind of step through it. And I was just thinking about this is Henry Ossawa Tanner's Gates of Tangier, which he made in 1912. And he makes this painting several times in different ways. But again, that sort of, this idea of a portal, of entryways, of movements into the unknown, of future possibilities that I think is so embedded in what you're doing, and I think is so important to the kinds of stories I hope I can tell. So I'll end there.
Yeah, thank you.
What?
It will be a wonderful time. Thank you. Yeah. Wonderful to see you all free associate, but with such clarity about the way, for somebody very visually minded, that worked so well to sort of think through images as a way to get out at ideas and share that process with us. And I wonder if we can participate in that now, if you want to facilitate questions, or if you want me to make sure we get everybody.
I'm happy to.
Start with Constantina, got that hand up.
Okay, thank you so much. This was one of the most substantial conversations that made me think a lot about my own work, too. So I am really grateful, and I have many thoughts, but let me just share some of them, and some of them are questions also. So one question concerns Todd's work, and if we can go to the green, the initial picture you showed us. I was thinking about the relationship between, between the water and the rock or the stone, because one thing is made of stone and then the other is watery, and he stands on watery ground. And I was thinking of, and then you have the Atlantic Ocean, of course, and I was thinking of this whole idea of, roots. What does it mean to stand on watery ground for your personal history, as you said, the way you mix, mythical past, because you actually your roots are quite watery 2 generations back. There is nothing. They are lost in the Atlantic, basically. And I was thinking of this constant presence of water in all your works, either I don't know all of your works, but most of your works, what I've seen, right? And your need to go to the Atlantic, right? To stay just there on the water. And I was thinking, what does this tell us about doing history, revisiting history in general, through the water? What would that tell us? And as a historian of the Mediterranean, is one of the things that I'm trying to do, recover histories told through the water, the history of the world through the water. Then I wanted to ask Anna, your whole approach, Anna, and your project is very fascinating, actually very relevant to what I do, since I work also in the 19th century, as you know, and I also work with artists. But I was very much intrigued by what you said about learning from contemporary artists methodological tools that you can use. And I wanted to hear more and see if you have found ways to actually incorporate or use pictures or these kind of things in your own work, which, as we know, is very narrative and very limited in certain sense, right? Let me see. And last point. It's about this idea of Rome, which is multi-layered, right? And I was thinking how, from that last picture you showed, that Rome is already multi-layered by itself. So it's like doing the work for you, the work that you have been doing, right? Putting all these layers. So what happens if you put Rome as a layer within all these layers? And I was just thinking about how this destabilizing. So you started, Todd, by saying that the idea of 19th century idea of photographs when they were born, like the technology of photographing, like being the exact representation, the documentation of the real thing. What Cesnola was doing actually with the pictures I showed, right? And actually it was very interesting when he was the director of the Met at Stiglitz, one of the first photographers, he tried to expose in the Met. Cesnola told him, no way, you won't be considering photography as a form of art, right? And I like this thing that you actually reverse the whole 19th century idea and the invention of photography as an evidence, as a document, right? Which shows the truth somehow. And so, I wanted to hear more about all these tensions between truth and myth and what is photography. Thank you.
Well, the watery ground, yeah, it would really, because the Atlantic provided the possibility of me being here, my ancestors being here. Going back to Ghana was a result of going there with Stevie Wonder in 1992 to shoot his album cover, and he kept saying, "Oh, Todd, this is where we're from, we're Africans," even though Steve said to me, we have no proof of it. So this is his dream. And I came to Ghana with this romantic notion after I got in 2006, NYU opened up a campus and invited Dead Willis invited me to exhibit there, and that's when I heard Steve's voice again saying, "Hey, this is where we're from," even though we had no proof, but there's a high probability that this is the case. So, and as I'm going there, it's the waterways, the slave trails are by water because they go into the ocean, and it's a sure way to get to the fort, to the slave castle. So there's trails next to those ways. And also, to me, there are these fantastic places of dreaming. There's this dream quality when I see them, and possibility. So as far as me standing on watery ground, having limited ancestral knowledge, I find that I'm using that as being completely liberating, so that I'm not beholden to the past. I can create my past, and I can revise it, and I can contradict it. And it's malleable, it's plastic. It's not fixed, so I'm trying to flip that for my own reasons. This city and its layers. Oftentimes I feel like I'm cheating because it's all done for me. All I'm doing really is I'm being the dumb painter, as it was called, just the dumb photographer, just click. But my work hasn't really been so in photo circles. I'm really not included in photo exhibitions as such, because I'm breaking too many rules. And my work is thought of as being sculpture. So it's, even though I'm a trained photographer, studied with Ellen Sakula, and that's another thing. Ellen Sakula is the archive, and that's what got me. Ellen is the one who got me to look into my archive. I don't think he'd really be, well, I don't know, God rest him. Although I'm not using it as strictly as document as Alan does for his archive, but I'm using it in a poetic way. So I'm going into my archive and using it in a poetic way, and I'm using photography in a poetic way, because I just can't. I'm resisting using photography and carrying on the discussion of photo history. I want to disrupt that, and that's why I'm making as I'm making.
Yeah, so thank you. I think this is one of the times when being an art historian is really helpful. Sorry, Hal. I just saw him looking over your shoulder. I was thinking, I'm going to apologise. No, I mean, because I think that we have to be working often transhistorically in a way that maybe in history you don't. I don't, I don't know. I do a kind of historical work, but I think it's often quite speculative, and so contemporary artists help me work through that process of trying to tell stories that maybe are very difficult to tell because there just isn't material, or because of the kinds of histories, difficult to tell because of the violences. In my book, each chapter begins with a contemporary artist, and so rather than sort of writing about them, I think of kind of writing with them. So I think the similar way that we were talking with Todd, the way that they're looking at some of these histories then gives me a way to think differently. And so that's, I think that's one of the wonderful things about art history, is that we start from objects and then we kind of use that to move us forward. So that's how I think about that methodological approach. Pretty and then Sarah.
Thanks very much for your conversation. I have a question which, when I was listening to both of you, I just recalled a series on Africa on PBS with Henry Louis Gates. And for me, it was a very African-American perspective. And I was sympathetic to it, but I was also not happy. And possibly it would be like if someone talked about India and talked about it from an American Indian perspective, I would be upset because it seemed like there was nothing. So it was a particular perspective, but I felt that Africans also were not allowed to express themselves in a full perspective. And I guess I'm curious because in a way, for both of your works, you're focusing on an African-American perspective. But is there then, is the conversation there also with an African perspective? Because an African perspective, like in a way, slave trades, the whole thing in Ghana, it speaks to African-Americans, it also speaks to Europeans, it speaks to the Anglo world as well. But does it speak to Africans? And can their perspective come also in their work? Similarly, for African-American artists with the possibility of coming for the Grand Tour in Europe, what are the possibilities for Africans, and from which part of Africa would they have? So I'm just curious, just to also, because we're also talking about this area as a crossroads, and so I'm wondering if that comes in.
I gotta say, I'm pissed with Africans in Ghana. I'm pissed, I'm pissed with the elites. I was over there during the harvest festival called Hamatan, and I was photographing the Nanas, the chiefs, because their forefathers would have sold my forefathers to the Europeans. And and then in Saidiya Hartman's book, so many Africans were denying that they had anything to do with the slave trade. I've been to historic slave markets there, so I'm motivated by my own history, I'm motivated by my own story, but I'm also making work that's critical, I haven't shown it here, that's critical of the Africans who participated, because I've been photographing the generations that preceded them. So that's about as full an answer as I can give you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that you were asking about African Americans here, right? That's what you were asking me. Yeah. So I haven't come across records of people from Africa being here. In the UK, yes. There's that's something I just don't have the space to look at right now, but I've looked at it in other ways, primarily thinking about the ways that histories of colonialism shape different experiences of blackness in different parts of the diaspora. And I'm also very interested in the ways that black experience in the Caribbean, in Britain, in the US, and in parts of Africa, South Africa, West Africa mostly, but intersect with experiences of other colonial communities in South Asia, and so that's the plantation. That's why I'm doing the plantation book. But in terms of the African Americans who are here, what's interesting to me and something I want to look at more is what Africa means to them, because it is a construction then as it is now in some ways, which I think is what Saidiya's book highlights for her, right? Is how West Africa gets constructed. So. But I think, I think that has often been the critique of African American studies, right? Is that black diaspora gets mediated through a very national. But I mean, I don't think that the black intellectuals who were working at the time were thinking that way. It's like Du Bois and even Harry Ossawa Tanner, and so I think that's why the transhistorical conversation is important.
Yeah, and I'm called Obruni when I'm there, and Obruni means white man. And so I'm really clumped with the West when I'm there, and so I'm very much aware of my outsider position in the culture. So I'm limited as to how far I can go. And so those that I do have the conversations with that are Africans are educated and come from very similar socioeconomic backgrounds as myself, which is kind of same.
I think class is a big part
class.
of it.
Sure. So I want to thank you both. As others have said, that was a great talk, and I really appreciate that you made it feel like we're part of a very intimate conversation. And with that kind of in mind, building on what Preeti said, I want to ask you if you can lean a little bit more into the perspective and maybe a kind of gendered perspective that I feel like for me sort of emerged. You started, Todd, with like who you are and how that has informed this work. And a lot of the pieces you showed us, it's a black man, whether it's you or someone else. And then your artist, I remember very, very vividly on it, the 5-minute presentations. Gina was right before you, and she said we should do women's history. And you were like, well, I have 2 black men that I'm going to talk about. And I think it's Dora's piece, that Memoirs of a Quadroon, maybe, but I think of rape when I hear that sort of. And I'm just wondering, like, the identity, like, how is identity negotiated for a black artist, whether that's in the 19th century or in the contemporary present? Is it a very gendered perspective? Does it come off as very masculine, like black man, or is there a feminine in there? Is there a female? And you brought up Edmonia Lewis. Does she stand alone? Are there others? Or can you maybe kind of think about that and whether gender is part of your work or informs your work, or how you embody your research or your work?
Sure. Well, yes, it's a great question. So I think for me it's about archives, right? So this is what I have. And so I'm kind of starting from that point. I think Dora's, his narrative is really amazing because it's, as I said before, there's all of these moments of eroticism where he's flirting with white women, and I don't really know what to do with that. I need to keep working on it. But what is significant is that in this broader context of travel narratives or black travel narratives in the 19th century, he's doing something very different to the respectability politics that was so important for black men and women in the 19th century because of how they were elided from gender because of race. So there's that. I think there's that tension. Edmonia is really fascinating because she's also a queer woman, and so I'm finding. Last week I was walking with Gina and a few other people, right, to these different spots where she had a studio where she may have lived, and what I'm finding is that there's this really interesting nexus of queer women, white and black. Well, just Edmonia so far, and African American companion / maid who worked for Charlotte Cushman, who was an opera singer and also an abolitionist and a patron of Duncanson. So there's this network emerging, but I just haven't. I mean, it's so scant. It's like literally trying to find like sentences in bits. But I think I think that respectability politics of the U.S. in mid-19th century plays a huge role in shaping how gender could be expressed by both black men and women, because blackness is always is othered, and that was the reason that Edmonia's sculpture was like such a because it caused so much sensation because it's made by a black woman. It's showing this moment of death, but a kind of ecstatic death, and it just brought it. So Edmonia is very careful in the way she's trying to present herself within those very very limited constructs of gender.
Yeah, I'm really making this construction of my own. My work is very autobiographical, and so I keep looking back and sort of trying to understand how it is that I have a certain mindset, how it is that I have a certain mentality, and what contributed to that. So going back to Ghana with Kiang Mi and building a place and trying to see this deluded romantic notion of returning to Mother Africa. What is that about? But I keep going back to myself, to my story, and to my own archive. So I am more interested in the construction of black male, and that is an endangered species. So that's also where my work is centered, But mainly, I think it's just the unfolding of my story. And in my archive, I think 90% of the album covers that I shot, black men, and that also was a reflection. So that's what's in the archive. I don't know if that's satisfactory, but that's where it's coming from.
I would just say though, Rome is, for white women, white American women, Rome is this place of possibility, right, to express what they are and who they are in any kind of way, but it's not like that for the black writers and artists who come, or so it seems anyway from what the writing is about. And Dora actually, what's the word? He makes an inscription. He's dedicating his narrative to his mother. So he's aware of this. I mean, he uses quadroon very, very consciously and purposely.
Dinva and then Gina, and then.
He actually has a question too. Sorry.
Dinva, then Gina,
Okay.
and then.
So can I think with you, Todd, a little bit? Could we go to the image of the apse?
Which?
So it's gold mosaics, apse. You took it, it has Van Gogh in the bottom.
The one from
Santa Maria in Trastevere.
The one
Yeah.
from Rome.
One last.
Your foot.
the church image, yeah.
Yes. So I'm going to think. I want to think about how this image is frustrating expectations, like you're obviously thinking about it doing, and thinking about what we're supposed to see at the center of that, right? Which is this authoritative figure of Christendom. And so I wonder here how your placing of a foot here can not only frustrate expectations, but create a different narrative of tension, of intended flight. Because if we're thinking about this as being the apotheosis, or this moment of seeking a future self, how can that foot there and the tension and this I see perceived movement here. I don't necessarily see it as a static, I see tension there. I wonder if you could speak to a little bit or think about how in a final image here, if this is not the final, forgive me if I'm thinking it might not be the final layout.
It's pretty close.
It's pretty close? Okay, so how you might articulate that even further or how you're seeing that positioning there.
Well, pictorially, the way the foot is placed on top of this piece of architecture and it appears to be balancing, I think by tensions by shifting slightly, because I'm trying to imply that it all rests on this invisible, visible subject. So, you know, as I put these together, it's a pictorial balancing act that I'm engaged in, and it's bringing us back to this contemporary moment with this photograph that intrigues me, and also the way when I look at that could be Achilles' heel. You know, that there's that ran through my mind. Yeah. So it's really fluid. I should invite you to my studio, and then we can talk about this a little more with that.
I'm also interested in the shadow, kind of mimicking the stole, the conceit at the bottom of each saint's dress, their mantle. So I'm thinking about that continuity there as well, in terms of in these kind of images, what it's supposed to represent in a sense is a denial that you can go into that naturalistic background. That's what the gold does. So I'm wondering how you're playing with that as well. But anyway.
Not considered.
Okay.
That's why, you know, this is a completely foreign culture for me. Like coming in and going into these, I'm going into these spaces blind, and I'm actually just responding to them. And then I am making these poems, these visual poems. But yeah, please, we'll have to meet in the studio.
Yeah. So Todd, I just want to say, for me, how very empowering your voice is and your art is. Looking at it, I kept thinking about Eve Tuck. She is an indigenous scholar, and the term that she uses for ways of reading, and kind of the demand that she desires, she wishes for the reader of, let's say, indigenous culture. I think she calls it desire-based, and to look at that in terms of the way in which her culture, the indigenous culture, has been constructed from damage-based, and to look at desire. And I think, and I can talk a little bit about it with you a little bit more, but what I hear in your work and the way you think about your work is that you are looking from that powerful desire-based construction, desire-based reading of yourself, of your world, of your past. And that desire-based reading does not say, don't look at the damage. Also look at the damage, because it doesn't fit, it doesn't make sense if you don't look at the damage. But if you don't look at the desire, it is also hugely disfiguring for the reader, for the constructor, and so on. So I just wanted to just say very publicly how honored I am, how empowered I feel by the voice that you're producing here. And I think in terms of my question for in terms of the work that you're doing with Duncanson and the African American, and then the question of okay, how does the African see it, but to look at it from the point of view of a reader producing that desire-based world. And I love the move into the future that you're constantly thinking of, because there's nothing else. There's nothing else, really. We need that forward look, you know. And I think indigenous scholarship has been so helpful for me, and I think it's so, I hear it. I hear Eve Tuck in the way you're speaking about your work, Todd. And you don't have to have read Eve Tuck to have desire-based reading.
Thank you for that, Gina.
That's a great, I love that essay, Gina. It's a really important essay.
I think that Liz and Ashley and Athena are three people who have questions on the horizon.
Am I next?
Yeah, Ashley and Liz and Athena are the three people I have on the horizon.
Thank y'all. I've been really taking many notes. So my question is about framing. Todd, your photographs like really charge the frame so that I really feel that the choice to frame and what kind of frame and the material of the frame becomes a huge monumental choice. And so my question is for both of you, like, how do you choose the material of your frame and what kind of frame? And also for Anna, like, for you to frame like why these artists chose to come here, and what frames you choose to center in your work, because as researchers and historians, everything is a choice in what you kind of highlight. So.
It's a pretty simple and compact answer for myself. The brown, they're modest, simple wooden frames. Now that I'm working at such a scale, I cannot get them at Goodwill or other sources, so I have to make custom frames, but it's very important. The brown has something to do about my own body, and that leads me into a selection of other stained. This is like a dark walnut stain as my skin, and so that the word, when I look at it, I don't expect the viewer, but I see it being wrapped in my own skin, and then the black. So oftentimes I'll put the black frame around to indicate blackness in its most direct form. I didn't show it today, but I also use gold frames, and when I do that, it's a celebration of our value and sort of like the idea of alchemy, that we can turn shit into gold. And so I'm using that. But mainly it's the color, and then the densities, the widths of it, so that it's more disruptive or less disruptive. So it separates and acts almost like an exclamation point. That becomes a choice.
Thank you for that question. I mean, I think it goes to what Gina was saying. What is possible when and I think that becomes even more important when you're working with histories that are difficult to find archives for, to narrate without re-traumatizing, right? And I was, my cotton book is really about the violence of those histories, and the way contemporary artists are using the past to try and to imagine kind of new possibilities for the future. But I was just really intrigued by what possibilities 19th century artists were able to find by leaving the US to express, perhaps to express other futures, or perhaps just to express senses of beauty. And again, I think what Todd was saying about being taught, I come from a very cultural studies background where aesthetics is always bad, it's like, it's not political. And so I'm like, no, actually, these artists were creating beautiful work, and Duncanson, there's very little actual letters that we have or any kind of archival text, but what we do have is him talking about how good he is at painting beautiful landscapes. And so that, for me, that was the frame. Like, what do these aesthetic relationships mean for an artist like Robert Duncanson, or for a writer like David Dorr, who's always talking about the kind of grandeur and beauty of Europe, and so that's the sort of framing I'm thinking about. But yeah, does that answer? Yeah. Okay. And then
Not much time left for Athena and Liz. We can both. Are we passing to lunch time? Okay, Liz.
Thank you both for this really fascinating and stimulating conversation. Just okay. So I have two thoughts. One sort of focuses in on actually the ideas about music and voice, And the term actually that you just used while we were talking in the Q&A of a visual poem, and the ways in which your work, some of the most stimulating things about your work, Todd, for me, have to do actually with the kind of like multimedia aspect of it, and how you're kind of placing different images and contextualizations and interfacing meanings in a way that becomes almost like a sonic resonance. It reminds me, as somebody who focuses on medieval and early modern culture, of things that happen in manuscript images where different types of visual imagery are placed in juxtaposition with each other and sort of in dialogue with each other create kind of a greater resonance of meanings. So that was just something that I was thinking about as I was sort of learning more about your work and seeing more examples of it. And from that, I wanted to go back to that idea and the images that surrounding the trumpet, and the images that Anna also brought in dialogue with that. Because I was also thinking in terms of this kind of mixing of your own work on this, the perspectives that you're bringing to it, the feelings that you brought to that initial self-portrait, right, of frustration, of anger, and then connecting that to some works from 19th century artists of Black trumpeters, and then thinking also to some elements of music history that have actually recently been coming out in my own field. There's some recent scholarship about Black trumpeters who worked for courts in 17th century Germany, and the important role that they had in society in those contexts as a result of their status as members of the royal court, as trumpeters who had a skill that were valued, and that it in many ways often allowed them to function in parts of society that they wouldn't otherwise be allowed to function in, first as enslaved people, but then eventually through their work as musicians of the court, being allowed to earn their freedom as part of the king's retinue, essentially. And there's some really interesting work that has recently been done by a scholar named Arna Spoor, who has actually talked about the sort of societal disruptions that were created by that type of societal status that Black trumpeters had in 17th century Germany, that created actually sort of violent disruptions in German life, where other people who were actually of a lower social standing but were white and from that part of Germany had sort of chafed at the idea of these Black trumpeters coming in and sort of essentially standing above them in the social hierarchy. And it just made me think of that in some of the work that I've been focusing on in my own work and in my pedagogy as well. This is something that I try to really highlight when I teach early modern European history, that we're not just talking about white people, but there are actually many Black people, Black Africans, and eventually also African Americans that are coming into European spaces. So I was sort of speaking, I don't know if this is even really a question, but also just sort of something to think through together, that your work and the work that Anna is bringing in, and that some of the work that is also coming out of musicological circles actually creates this really fascinating dialogue about Black musicians in various different types of spaces and what that says about them, both as creators, but also as just members of community. So
we all want to go to lunch, and I know that I'm going to give you a very economical reply. I studied with Baldassare, and one of the things that really, which also, okay, what happens when you put this with that? And so the context, and that context shifts, and then these third meanings come about. And that's what really, something happened when I put this with that. I cannot really go into it and explain it. So it's not didactic. There is just a visual resonance and response that I get by doing that. And that really is what leads me on in my work. And that's where these visual poems, these haikus, they come. And so I rely on y'all to then go and extract and expand and bring your expertise to it.
Various glimpses of how they work.
To sleep on we have it away. So rich. Did you get some rest? Did you enjoy it? Where's the
No, you're not English sounding. I also wanted to say that.
right?
And that's what's the area where we're
Today, but it's not that very strict.